Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I am your host, Joanna. Let's get started.
Welcome back to the show. Joanna is currently away, so I'm Marie, your host for the day. Today we're exploring grief and how to ease the pain we feel from it. It's a universal human experience, yet the way in which we experience it is far from universal. What is grief to one person could be a minor inconvenience to another. There is no right or wrong way to grieve, but one thing is for sure, healing from grief takes resilience. So that's exactly what we're discussing this week. I'm joined by specialist grief counselor Ellie Mills. She currently runs Grief Guides, where she offers counseling and supervision, supporting individuals who are hoping to approach the grieving process differently. Hi, Ellie. Thanks for joining the show. How are you going today?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you about this. But before we begin, what do you think it means to approach the grieving process differently?
Sure. So I think when I talk about doing grief differently, I think it's because we as a culture just don't do grief well. We don't talk about it, we avoid it, we allow people to grieve for as long as, what I often say, as long as the funeral flowers are alive. And then there's this expectation that you wrap it up, you put it in a box, you resolve that grief somehow in some way, shape, or form. And we just don't know that that's not the case. So for me, allowing people to grieve differently is really allowing them to grieve at all and for the lifespan that grief is going to exist for them. So sitting in the rubble, doing grief, doing the hard work of being in pain and grieving and finding space for that really painful experience, which we, as I say, we just don't do. So in some ways, anything different to boxing it up and putting it away is different and will be beneficial for people.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like a lot of it is both internal and external. Like internally, we feel like we can't grieve for longer than the funeral flowers are alive. And then externally, people who do from the outside, they might think like, oh, um, it's been a while, like what's going on?
Yeah. Well, it's really painful and it's really uncomfortable. And I'm sure we've all had that experience where someone is sitting in front of us, a friend or a family member, and they're just sad and they continue to be sad. And we've run out of things to say and we want to fix it so badly, but there aren't really necessarily words to fix something that's unfixable. So we can do that sometimes for a little bit and some more than others, but then we kind of want to jolly people along and make them feel better. And it's really hard to sit with people for the length of time that the pain is going to exist.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think as a society, we are really uncomfortable with grief and feelings of sadness, just being out and about in the open, like just being sad at brunch or something like that. We have discomfort with that.
We do. And if I think about our systems as well, I mean, workplaces, you maybe get a day of leave for bereavement leave, or you maybe get, some tiny bit of space to take away and try to make sense of this sometimes really significant, painful experience, which, I mean, we're talking about a death-related loss, but then we haven't even touched on yet, and I'm sure we will, the non-death-related losses and fertility losses and the ambiguous side that just is meant to happen while we're working and parenting and being a daughter or a son or a sibling or a friend. And the reality is it's just there's so many roles that we hold while we're grieving, and we have to juggle all of that when our whole world has been shaken by this experience.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, I think that's really, really well put. I would love to go further into detail about this later on in the interview. But before we do that, I would also love to get to know you better. So this is Have You Met Ellie Mills? And my first question for you is, what do you like to do in your spare time?
Oh, that's a tricky question, Marie, because I have small children. So, what is spare time? I would say. I think, given that I have little ones, I think for me, reading is a really big one. That if I have a moment when the kids are in bed, I love to bring out a book and to sort of sit on the couch and dive into a story. My husband will often give me a really hard time about the type of books that I like to read, which are particularly crime novels or the kind of ones that are, it's always the husband that does something, which he finds quite hilarious. But I think for me, I like to escape into a story and into the world of something that's can take my mind into a little bit of fantasy there.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
I feel
So
you.
yeah, you as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, I'm not a huge book reader anymore just because, well, I honestly am such a slow reader that it's just not worth it, to be honest.
Yeah.
But if you give me any TV show or movie that is fantasy genre, I will soak it up even if it's like a 1 star like kind of
Really,
rating.
it doesn't matter.
I probably just sit there and be like, "Oh, okay. Yeah." So I do kind of get it.
Yes. Absolutely. And I think, I sit, every day I'm sitting with clients and I'm talking about deep, dark stories and sadness. And I think that escapism is something that I
Mm.
yearn for. I think I really notice when my mind is feeling full and overwhelmed. I'm not the type of person that can go into a nonfiction book. I need something that takes me away from work and is something that's creative a little bit, I suppose, and can make my mind wander and really enjoy, I suppose, another world.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's really exciting to hear. Is there anything that you're reading at the moment?
Oh, yes. I mean, I'm reading something, but I must say I'm a little bit of a fast reader, so I don't hold on to them for too long. I read something just recently that was called "Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone," which is quite an interesting title, I think, and quite dark. And again, you can see why my husband gives me a little bit of a hard time, but it was quite humorous, and I think a really interesting way of looking at yeah, different what that even means
Mhm.
around I guess loss in a story in a fictional kind of way.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. And what do you think are the like top few highlights about this book?
That's a good question. I think the humorous element, it had a little bit of dark humor about even just the it talked a lot about the tropes of storytelling and
Mhm.
how a little bit like the movie Scream, and you know how they kind of they broke up how horror movies are made. It was kind of that sort of a tone of how do you write a crime novel. So it was a little bit meta in some ways
Right.
of how do you
Yeah.
write a crime novel, and it sort of had on each page, these are the pages that there'll be the reference to a death or a
Mhm.
dying kind of story, and a little bit of that was quite humorous to me, I think.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So thank you for sharing that. Now, you mentioned previously that you had little ones right now and therefore have little time to yourself. So, are there any activities, well, I love little ones too. Love the little ones, but are there any activities that you've been thinking like, oh, once my little ones grow up, I will dive right back into this?
Hmm. I think just having a bit of a social life. Again, it's not in a playground. There's a lot of my catch ups that revolve around very short conversations as we're all kind of looking for where are the children running to and what's happening and who's screaming at any given point. So I think having a bit of space to just not, I don't know, finish a thought, finish a sentence would be lovely. That's the beauty of work, I think, in some ways, being able to actually finish a job or sit in a space of deep thought. I enjoy, but me too. I mean, I love my little people. I love
Yeah.
the children's space. I love the role of being a mum, but I'm sure the parent listeners that are out there will empathize with just the fog of the brain that comes with having the small people.
Yeah. And are there any activities that you do really enjoy partaking in with your kids?
I I really do enjoy I think just the fun of kids, whether it's going to the playground or doing something that builds their excitement, going and getting ice cream or going on an adventure on the train, to just the act of parking and walking to the train, getting on the train, going and doing something like. And I think the beauty of anything can become a little bit of an adventure, which I
Yeah.
really enjoy. You know, my kids are 18 months and 4, so they're very little. And you just see their whole face light up when you do
Yeah.
something. You know, my son loves to go to the aquarium and look at all the fish and just all the conversations that we have. So yeah, I think the joy is the part that kind of comes along with any of those activities that we do.
Yeah, that is so true. I remember as a kid myself, I would be so excited to go to the grocery store and to be able to like give coins or like do the mathematics of like what change I should be getting and stuff like that. And it really does remind you of the simpler things in life and how to
Yeah.
yeah, how to
I
yeah.
think I don't know if you've seen the new Inside Out movie, but I saw that and nearly sobbed the whole time, because I think there's one quote in it around, I think as an adult we lose a lot of the joy that we have as children, and that connection. It's almost having children, I think, is a little bit of a window back into that world and seeing the world through their eyes. I empathize with what you're saying around the money, because you know we've started doing a recycling project with my boy, and you know, you build up the cans and the boxes, and then you take it to the recycling, and then you get some money for the money box. And just even that, who would think that that would be an exciting job that you could do? But it really is.
Yeah, that's so great to hear. Um, yeah, I feel like we got to know you a bit better. It was really such a delight to get to know you. My last question for you is either in your professional life or your personal life, do you have a role model? Is there someone that you look up to?
Hmm. I think no single person comes to mind, but I think what's coming into my brain is just a whole number of people. I think personally and professionally, there are certainly family members with traits that I really admire and really respect. My one of my uncles in particular was someone who had that really joyful spirit. He was incredibly playful,
Mhm.
fun, but also somebody that you knew you could trust and that you could turn to, and some really beautiful qualities there. And then there are a number of professional mentors and colleagues and friends who have been such compassionate, kind, um, knowledgeable people that still remain in my corner, and people that I could turn to at any point. So there are absolutely people, and I think it's almost curating your village and your network of who are the people that you respect, that you admire, that you could turn to in times of challenge. And my hope would be that I would be that person for somebody else as well, now or down the track.
Yeah, that's really sweet. I'm sure you'll get there, or I'm sure that you probably are one right now. Like, yeah, probably to your kids. Um, well, yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that. It's been such a pleasure getting to know you. But now let's get down to business. My first question for you, as this is a personal resilience podcast, is why do you think resilience is important in our lives?
I think resilience is important because loss is universal, as you said at the beginning. I think it's life in many ways is about challenge and hardship, and it's that duality of loss and grief, and also life and joy. And I think we need resilience to make it through all of the challenges that we face. It's inevitable that we're going to come up against struggle, and to, to be able to face those things, to be able to work our way through it, we need to find tools and strategies and ways to cope with challenge, so that we're not completely drawn under by those hardships, that we can make sense of it, that we can find a way through, that we can build upon our skills and our resources to cope with this one, but then, of course, the next thing that we're going to face as well.
Yeah. And many people also have this idea that resilience means that you're immune somewhat to stresses and adversity, or you take it on very, very well. What do you think about this notion?
Oh, I disagree. I don't think so. I think it's I think it's really impossible to be immune to hardship. I think it's the more that we live, the more that we struggle, the more challenges we face. As I said before, it's when we talk about loss, it's not just the what we would traditionally talk about being the big ticket items of death, dying, bereavement, those sorts of things. It's loss of identity or loss of self or loss of our perceived future, physical function, innocence. When we talked about childhood just before as well, there's so many losses: fertility losses, pet loss, all sorts of different challenges. And the idea that we could be immune to struggle, gosh, I would love to meet that person. That would be amazing to be that
Yeah.
person that just had all of these things wash over us. But I think that the more that we live, the more and the more instances of life that we have, the more we're going to be faced with adversity. And so I think we all have the ability to cultivate resilience by finding ways to cope, by finding ways to manage. But I think if we're setting ourselves up to have the goal to be immune to struggle, then I think we're going to be setting ourselves up for failure. There's something about being able to face those challenges and to be in that discomfort again, around not shying away from it. That resilience is about almost, stepping into the fire of that challenge and developing those skills and those resources to cope.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like um there is not enough credit being given to people who really feel all the feelings during grief. I feel like people have this idea that that's not being resilient when in fact it's being very resilient because it takes a lot to be honest and feel the feelings.
Absolutely. I feel like those are the messages from previous generations of weakness and that you're too sensitive and all of these really challenging messages that we received. I certainly know that I probably inadvertently received those when I was growing up, and certainly generations before me of, yes, it's weak to cry or just shut it away, or, that parenting kind of trope of it's okay, it's okay. And sometimes it's not okay. And it takes a whole lot of strength to acknowledge that and that vulnerability to be able to say, this is incredibly painful and I don't know the way forward and I can't fix some of these things. To be able to sit in that discomfort, in that pain is probably, I would say, the hardest thing that we can do. And certainly then that added layer of talking about it and sharing that with others who also, as we said, don't necessarily create space for grief and for hardship and for those difficult feelings. To do that as another layer, that's another layer of resilience and strength and power, I would say.
Yeah, 100%. And I even know a doctor. This actually isn't like entirely directly related, but there are some like crossovers. I know a doctor who actually once told me that the disease that he would never want to have is depression.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
What are your
What did you
thoughts on
think?
that? Well, I thought that was very apt because well, there's a lot of empathy, I think, for physical diseases. Not to like dilute it or diminish it whatsoever. I think the experience is entirely different on its own. But there's a bit more of a like like not gravity brevity to the situation. At least most people give it that. But with depression, a lot of people, at least the previous generations, and this might have trickled down to some people in our generations. um there's this mentality that like, oh, it's just depression and everybody goes through it, and like everybody will get out of it at some point. It just takes time and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's with the physical, you can see it. There's a framework
Yeah.
for it. There's a treatment plan for it. There's a sense of, even if you can't necessarily resolve that injury or illness or condition or whatever it might be, there's a greater sense of understanding where depression or grief, which of course are different experiences but have similarities in this case, their internal experiences that are so individualized and can't be seen, and people have that need to carry on and continue to work, to parent, to live, to do all of these things while they're carrying this immense burden that you carry with you, that you don't resolve in the same way, or there's not a clear path out of that darkness. And so, yeah, I think that's a really interesting comment and a really poignant one to consider around what's harder to hold. And of course, challenge is challenge in many ways, but certainly when it comes to grief, it's incredibly misunderstood, and it's an immense burden to carry.
Yeah, I think like similar to depression, grief also, um, a lot of people have the expectation that grief will just subside on its own and like just time is going to heal, which I'm sure in some cases it does, but I feel like it's not that universal to say that happens with everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the stages of grief model has been, of course, incredibly beneficial in some ways to talk about grief and to start those conversations. But it also has been challenging because it puts out there that there's this idea that you'll tick off some jobs or some tasks and you'll resolve grief once you do, and that you'll
Mhm.
come to some end point. And certainly the evidence and the research suggests that that's not the case. And there is no linear pathway through grief. You may experience some of those stages of grief, but you might not. You may feel none of those things, and it might be a completely different experience. And certainly we talk now about you will never resolve your grief. You will find a way to cope with it. Your life will grow around that grief, but the grief doesn't shrink over time. It stays just as big. And it's something that some people talk about it being like a backpack that they wear, that over time it might get a little bit lighter, or you might be able to put down that backpack. There might be other things that you can put into that backpack besides just your grief, but it's your backpack. It's something that you're going to take with you forevermore into your future.
Yeah, it's also a deeply personal journey. So, what do you think people need to do in order to better understand themselves and what their experience with grief might be like?
I think, there's a quote that talks about the only cure for grief is to grieve. And I think it's a really beautiful quote that I often come back to and will share with clients around really allowing space to dip your toe into that grief and see what comes up, because it's going to be so individualized. It's going to be an all encompassing experience, because what we know about grief is it has this ability to shatter our assumptions, all of the bedrock on which we build our view of the world, our values, our beliefs. The idea of good things happen to good people. We are going to be born, we live a life, we die in old age, we're going to live our entire life alongside our siblings. Parents will not outlive their children, all of these things that we believe to be true and are assumptions that we hold dear. And for many of us, that will be the case, but of course, some people that won't be. And our entire world becomes shattered by a grief experience. And the fallout is going to be incredibly different and varied for every individual person. For some people, it'll be the social connections that they grieve really significantly after a loss, because, as we said, people feel uncomfortable about grief. They don't know what to say. They don't know whether to acknowledge that loss. And so oftentimes they'll just disappear. And then the grieving person suddenly is grieving, but they also don't have anybody to turn to. They don't have their best friend to talk to about that. They're not perhaps invited to social events, or if their child has died, they no longer get to go to the school or to all of the different activities or things that might have happened at that on a social side of things, or that side of things. For some, it'll be the existential angst that comes from grief that's pronounced. I know many clients who really reckon with their relationship with God or a spiritual being or whoever it might be, or just how on earth could this happen to me? And what does it mean? Does it mean that I've done something? Is this my punishment that I have to reconcile? For some, it'll be the physical element. We know that the link between mental health and physical health is so pronounced, and people will feel that grief in their body. They will feel chest palpitations. They will feel fatigued. They'll have brain fog. There will be a whole number of physical impairments and implications that will come from grieving that are so significant. Of course, the emotional side of things. Really, the list goes on, and I could sort of unpack all of that in a lot more detail, but I guess it's going to be different for everyone. And until you find some of that courage to step into that grief. It's really hard to know. For many, they will avoid going into the grief because it is so painful. For some, there'll be a traumatic element to their grief that means that it's hard to step in. So I guess my invitation would be finding some space to have a moment of grief and then taking a break from it. Knowing when the grief shows up, what does that feel like? What does that look like? What's happening within your body? What do you need to do to hold it in a way that's safe for you? But then also, what do you do to catch your breath? Because we can't sit in our grief for prolonged periods of time. Certainly when we're talking about the acute stages of grief, our bodies don't really allow us to do that for a prolonged period of time. And we would say what we're wanting is a really beautiful oscillation between grieving and then also taking a break and stepping in. And really, I guess we need to do that, as I've said, to continue parenting and working and life as it moves on. But noticing what shows up. So this is, I guess, where that self-reflection comes in of, when I grieve, what does that look like? What does that feel like? And what do I need to do to support myself?
Yeah. And what coping mechanisms or expressive outlets would you recommend for those navigating grief, and how do you think it contributes to the overall resilience of experiencing grief?
Well, again, I think it's going to be really individualized. So you've got some people who are going to be far more intuitive in the way that they cope with grief. So these are the people that will want to talk about their grief or will want to cry or be really expressive in their grief. And that's incredibly normal and helpful. For some, they might want to be prompted to do that by listening to music or looking at photos or sharing stories, or some of that side of things can be a really beautiful way of grieving in an expressive way. Some people journal to get sort of their thoughts and their feelings out on paper. For some, they're going to be the doers and more of the intrinsic grievers. So these are the task-oriented people who may not be the ones that sit and talk and cry and really outwardly express their grief, but they're going to be the ones that might be the people that tick off a checklist, and they might be the ones that need a project to manage their grief. They might be the ones that plant a garden or create something, or are the ones that might be grieving while they're clearing out clothes or items or that sort of thing. Some people move their body. Certainly exercise is a really beautiful way of shifting some energy and letting the energy and the emotions out in a different way. It's sort of how long there's a piece of string, really, when it comes to grief. But I wonder if there's an element of looking at what's worked for you in the past in different hardship, in different challenges. When you're feeling stressed and overwhelmed, what do you tend to do? What helps to feel a little bit better, to shift that energy a little bit? There's some of the things that you might start to look into, to put into place in this experience too.
Right. So there shouldn't be a shame as well in, like, for example, if you see a family member, like someone in the family is passed away and a family member is, I don't know, playing a video game, there shouldn't be a shame in that. That's how they cope, and everyone copes differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's what you've identified there, Marie, is a really common challenge in families in particular. Is what you'll have is you've got a family of people that are grieving in very different ways, and it's almost like you've got people going up and down in their grief on every given day, and they're all doing that alongside each other. So some people will be actively grieving and some people will be taking a break from it. Some people will be doing that expressively. Some people will be doing something that's to avoid their grief or to process it differently. And I guess what I will often say is there really is no right or wrong way to grieve. As long as you're not causing harm to yourself or to somebody else, then you're doing what you need to do to survive and to get through it. And we can support each other. And my hope would be, more generally, all of us support each other better to do what you need to do to get through this. But absolutely playing a video game, taking a break. We can't just sit and cry and grieve and stay in that heavy place all the time. We need to have some moments of something else. And it's almost kids and young people in particular do this often really well, where it's like they're jumping in and out of puddles of their grief, where they'll jump into a puddle and they'll do that for a little bit, and then they'll go and they'll run off and they'll play, and that's a really healthy and really normal way of grieving that I think we could all actually learn a little bit from as we do it. But just to say it's okay for someone to do it differently. Often you'll find partners that someone wants to cry and talk and someone wants to go off and do other things, and they can feel really resentful of each other around, don't you feel this? Isn't this as big for you or as significant? And we can give each other a little bit of a hard time around how we grieve. And I think it's giving each other permission to just do what you need to do sometimes is the best.
Yeah, for sure. I will say though, the task doers would be really helpful at the funeral part because
Absolutely.
that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny. I think of an example in my personal life where when my grandfather died and we were all sort of in the hospital and at his bedside, and I saw this play out where the bumping up against each other and doing it differently, where one of my uncles was sitting there and he was very much in that deep grief and mourning. And then my dad was a doer, and he very much instantaneously was onto his checklist and onto we need to do this, this, and this. And they had conflict around it because my uncle saw my dad as being uncaring and unfeeling. And how could you possibly talk about that right now when our dad has just died? And I wish in many ways that I had this knowledge and this insight to be able to, not that I would want to do a grief counseling session there at that particular moment, but you see it play out to be able to say, you're both doing what you need to do, but it's really hard. And it's really hard when you're not, speaking the same language of grief, really.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, that I feel like that's pretty reminiscent of a lot of situations that are similar to yours. But yeah, I think people should be a little bit more open-minded as well as to like how grief manifests in different people. And I think it's adorable that your dad immediately went like, okay, we need to do this and this and this.
Yeah. And, I think he could have taken a moment. He could have taken a moment, a bit more sensitivity, but, that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, like, not to, like, play into stereotypes and stuff, but I feel like some men do that, like, just not have that emotional awareness as much. But that's really interesting to talk about. And then with the later, like, turning into the later parts of grief that you mentioned before, where the grief never fully goes away. It just there are more things that surround it and make it seem a bit more manageable and smaller. So when it comes to this transition from like the early stages of grief to like the middle parts and like the later parts and lightening the load, finding meaning while experiencing that grief can help a lot. So what how do you think individuals can kind of head down towards the path of finding meaning and purpose? Do you think this will help at all?
Yeah, I think it's a really beautiful part of, I suppose, reconciling loss. And as I've mentioned, I think it can be a lifelong process for some people to find meaning. And even the concept is a really challenging one because I'm thinking of a number of different examples where for some, they may never find meaning in what the loss is or what has happened. The loss of a child will never make sense. That it's not meant to make sense. It doesn't, that's not okay. Or a suicide or some of these traumatic kind of elements, a homicide, those sorts of things. So for some, it won't be necessarily the finding the meaning of the death itself or the particular circumstance, but there's absolutely opportunities to make meaning of who I am in the face of the loss, or the fact that I've been able to survive the most unsurvivable loss that there is, and the strength that I've found, or the connections that I have made, or the life and the love that I've had with this person prior to that loss, or those sorts of the things are the parts of meaning making that I think is really beautiful. Or being able to stay connected with a loved one after they've died. The idea of what we would call continuing bonds, where the death of a loved one is not the end of a relationship. It's a redefining of how do you stay connected to somebody? How do you honor their memory in different ways? How do you continue to keep them with you? Do you have them as sort of a voice on your shoulder, or are there signs or symbols that you see around in the world to keep you connected to them, and what meaning that brings to your life. All of those sorts of parts I think are incredibly beautiful, and it's connected to that, I guess, that resilience and that sense of purpose, and to find little moments of joy and hope and connection going forward, where in that acute stage, there's really not the space for that. It's around grounding yourself and survival and managing that intensity of feelings. But absolutely, that, as you say, this part that comes later is really integrating that loss and finding who I am in the world now, because the reality is you will have changed depending on the experience that you've had. You won't be the same person that you were prior to that loss. And that's a whole life's journey, is who am I and how do I bring the positive parts or that meaning into the future as well.
And as we conclude our conversation, what key advice or message would you like to leave our listeners with about easing the pain of grief and fostering that personal resilience?
I think the main message for me is really, it's almost twofold. It's allowing ourselves to grieve and then allowing other people. It's being able to acknowledge that this is incredibly painful. It's uncomfortable. It's messy. People aren't going to do this in a neat and socially acceptable way, but letting people do it. We need to grieve. The more that we avoid it, the more problems show up for ourselves, for other people. And it's just so bizarre to me that it's this universal experience, and yet it's the universal thing that we avoid. So I think of what the world would be like if we just let people feel what they needed to feel. I think we wouldn't need specialist grief counselors. We'd be able to just support each other a little bit better. So let people be sad, let people be in pain, let ourselves do that too. Again, that vulnerability for ourselves to let go and to be messy and to be possibly the worst versions of ourselves for a time. We have to do that to move through it, to find our resilience, to find hope again. It's going to show up at some point. Grief and loss is universal. So even if we don't face this loss here, there's going to be another one, and this one's going to come along with us. So at some point, we're going to have to step into that grief and learn ways to cope. And my hope would be that we can support ourselves and other people to do that a little bit better.
Yeah. And for those people who want to learn a little bit more about how to better support their loved ones through grief, what advice do you have for them?
There's many opportunities. So certainly that's part of my role so I offer counselling for individuals and family members who are grieving or are supporting other people who are grieving. But there's also training opportunities. There's a whole, I think, podcast like this, learning about grief. If it's something that even if you're not able to say the word died, if you can't talk about grief, if there are things that are feeling like, oh, I don't want to go there, my suggestion is that's the stuff you need to learn about. That's the stuff to go and watch a movie about grief, to go listen to a podcast, to talk to someone who's had a hard time and to sit with them for a little bit. But certainly there are always supports and resources out there as well from a professional standpoint. But if you scratch the surface around your network, you're going to find people that are grieving. Have a conversation with that person.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all of that, Ali. It's been such a delight talking to you about this. I learned a lot, and I think it was a very enlightening conversation. Now we'll move on to the open mic section. This is your chance to talk about anything that you're passionate about that doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is yours. Take it away.
Well, I think if I was thinking about what to speak about, I think in particular, we haven't touched on children too much. So I have done a lot of work with children and young people who are grieving, and I think it's another layer down from the general grief experience in our youngest grievers. And I think we have such a beautiful opportunity to support children and young people through their grief, to set them up well for the rest of their lives. So as I say, I've worked with children who are from 5 years old up to 18 and beyond who perhaps have had their first grief and loss experience. And it's such a privileged space to sit with a child and to get their sense of what is loss, what does that mean, and the wisdom that comes from a young person who is grieving, who You ask them to draw sadness and the things that they'll draw, or happiness or anger or loss itself. And they have a framework. They have a way of seeing the world that we need to tap into and listen and foster. I think it's a really beautiful space to build a positive way of grieving that can take them into the future.
That's interesting. So tell me more about that and what the framework is.
Well, I think it's being comfortable with letting them grieve. So, oftentimes you'll hear parents say, should my child come to a funeral, or should they see the body, or how do I tell them that their grandparent has died, or whoever it might be? And 9 times out of 10, my response is, what's the barrier in telling them, or what do they know as well? I think children are incredibly intuitive, and they pick up on a whole lot of messages even when they're not being spoken to directly about what's happening. So there's a quote that speaks to children are not illogical. They're just simply limited by their life experiences. So children are going to hear whispered conversations, or notice that maybe mom and dad are arguing, or sad or stressed, or something's unfolding. And what they'll infer is that they've done something wrong, or their parents are divorcing, or something that makes sense based on their worldview, where oftentimes they don't know that it's because someone's died or something's happened. So what I would often say is to have an honest conversation with a child in an age-appropriate way about what's happened. So it's okay to say to a child, grandma has died, grandma's body has stopped working, and she has died, and we can't play with grandma anymore. Those are the sorts of things to be really clear with the young person about what's happened, without using euphemisms, without talking about we haven't lost grandma, because of course for a child that means, well, we need to find her. Where is she? Let's go get her. Or all sorts of other things like she's gone to sleep. And I've had children say, well, what happens when I go to sleep? Does that mean that my body stops working too?
Yeah.
And all sorts of things that we try to soften, and we tiptoe around it. And being able to say, somebody has died, they've stopped working, I'm safe, you're safe, your body is okay, it's okay to be sad. I mean, think about that. I mean, that's such a different message, I think, to what probably you were told or what I was told. And imagine what that would do to a child for their trajectory, to have that framework of something's happened to them, it hasn't happened to me, but I have a response to that. I feel sad. What am I going to do with my sadness? I'm going to draw. I'm going to punch my pillow. I'm going to roar like a dinosaur because I'm so angry about what's happened. And that's okay. I'm going to go to the funeral and wear what I want to wear to honor my grandma. I might write her a card to say that I love her and I miss her. I'm going to have a ritual to be able to honor the fact that she meant something to me. Perhaps on her birthday, I'm going to light a candle for grandma and we're going to talk about her and share memories. I mean, you can see how some of these things that we're doing by being open and honest about grief, even the fact, I as mum, I'm going to cry about the fact that we've lost grandma, because that also makes me sad. It's okay for mum to cry. It's okay for me to cry. All of that builds this really beautiful way of saying grief is okay. And we talk about grief, and we talk about grandma because she mattered, and she will continue to matter, and we'll continue to bring her into our lives as we go forward. We might put a Christmas ornament on the tree for grandma and talk about what she might have liked to do this Christmas. Those are the sorts of things that I think getting in early with kids is such a beautiful opportunity to set them up and to stop some of this stuff of grief is messy, ugly. We don't talk about it. We shove it away. Grief just is.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's such a good route to go down with young parents. I mean, like the way that I grew up was basically like after a funeral that we've just had, or something like that. We'd have dinner maybe, and everyone would be a little bit mopey, but no one talks about the actual thing that just happened. No one talks about it. Like we just sit down in sadness and talk about everything but what just happened.
Everything else.
Yeah.
Yep. It's bizarre, isn't it? But it's and you think that's all of our generations that are doing that. It's no wonder we're in this state where we've been able to do that for some time, but it's almost, I feel like there's this reckoning that's coming, or at least I hope so, that says, well, it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, well, I hope that there'll be a reckoning as well. So thank you so much for sharing that and for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed our conversation. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
Sure. So you can find me at griefguide.com.au or on Instagram, which is griefguideau. And I hope people do reach out if they're wanting to hear a little bit more, or as I say, to do grief a little bit differently, to have a conversation about what's happening with you. Loss is for those death-related losses, but as I said, it's for everything else as well. All of these parts that I guess we don't see, we don't acknowledge, but we carry.
Yeah, it could even be estrangement as well. That's a form
Absolutely.
of grief. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of my roles was working in family separation with children, and that's a huge loss, is your family has shifted, and what that experience is like, where the world that you're in with parents that suddenly are in different houses is really different, and relationships have changed and all of those sorts of things. Divorce is a really big one that comes up that people have a need to grieve.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like the umbrella of grief needs to be, well, it does kind of encompass a few different types of grief, but I think the general consensus of what grief is should be expanded a little bit more.
Yeah, I agree. I often say to people, I don't think you have a challenging experience without some loss that underpins it. Otherwise, it wouldn't matter. You wouldn't have an impact. But yes, certainly, again, it's like we're in a culture where we're so uncomfortable with loss that we've pinpointed it to only this tiny little experience, which
it must be death.
It must be death. That's
it
the
must
only
be a
thing
close family member.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's certain people that die, and it's so pigeonholed to this is when you can access support. And the reality is there are a whole range of experiences that for some they'll be fine and they'll have that personal resilience and the ability to cope. But for some, they just may need an outsider to sort of journey along with them.
Yeah. Well, we'll link the show notes. We'll link your website and your social media in our show notes so everyone can access it. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
Thanks, Marie.
You have been listening to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, pr.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Joanna. Thanks for tuning in.